You're listening to In Defense with Dr. R.G. Willert, a Christian apologetics podcast equipping you to give a defense for the hope that is in you and to speak truth in Jesus' name. On today's episode, we'll be revisiting some listener questions about the Kalam cosmological argument, including its veracity and its place in theology.
You are listening to In Defense with me, Dr. R.G. Willert, a Christian apologetic podcast bringing you an appeal and defense of the Christian faith. We are back with our Checking In series. We are going to do part 2 of episode 1. We had no idea that part 1 was going to be as long as it did, but we got into some great conversations. Like always, I'm here for this series with my editor, Eric Stroud. Say hi. I was going to say hi, but just did that wave, guys.
Well, yeah.
For those just listening, you did a really weird wave, just to let you know.
But the thing is, with podcasts with cameras, this is something I'm still very unused to.
So just that weird silence was him waving to you guys. He was trying to be friendly and saying hi. But we are jumping back in. We are on question 2. Yes, the first episode took up question 1, but we're going to see.
We had a lot of notes.
Yeah, if we can move quickly through these next questions for you. So go ahead. What do we have for your questions and our viewers and listeners' questions for us on the Kalam series?
I believe this is another one that I wanted to ask. So question 2, we covered a lot in the last episode about some of the other arguments that we use. You know, we talked about some of the NDE arguments. We talked about this guy's name, which I'm not going to try and pronounce. That one. And talked about the fine-tuning argument. So I'm still kind of reeling from all of that. Why the Kalam over the other arguments?
Sure, yeah.
Because you talked a lot about, in our first series, about the Kalam cosmological argument. You talked about why this one was your favorite.
Yes.
Why do you think this one is a good starting point for people who are looking for reasons for God? Sure.
So I have a few points I have here. The first is it is a good blend of science and philosophy. I think when it comes to faith, people who don't want to believe or think I'm nuts will always appeal to some sort of science. Like, I'm a science person. Science can tell us everything about reality. That's just blatantly false, right? It can't tell us about morals, right? It can't ground those things. But I think it's a good blend of both science and philosophy when it comes to to get respect with people who are all about science. I think you need to have that somewhere in your conversation. And this includes both of them. And a lot of times people who deal with science aren't up on philosophy. And for them to go, okay, yeah, that's great science, but hold on, let me add another dimension that you might not be familiar with that is just as strong, and I think even stronger than the scientific arguments. So that it's a good blend is something that really appeals to me when I first started looking into the argument. The second reason why I choose that one over the other arguments is it is theologically neutral to begin with.
Yeah.
It just is. I'm not starting off with the premise of God exists, right? It's not even getting you to that premise. It has nothing to say about God, right? Think about it. Whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. There's no Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, doesn't mention God, doesn't mention Jesus, doesn't mention any sort of dogma. It's just whatever begins to exist has a cause. Did the universe begin to exist? Therefore, it has a cause.
Yeah.
But what it does, it leads us to a conclusion logically, which I like, that has sort of theological implications. That as a Christian, I can go, I'm going to look at this argument that doesn't have theology or God written all over it. And given the science and philosophy, I can go, wait, I'm very reasonable and to think that something like God exists.
Yeah.
So the fact that it starts off and is just theologically neutral is something I absolutely love. So someone can't go, you're biased.
Yeah.
You have God in the premise.
From God. Yeah.
You're starting from God. And I'm going to go, where?
Yeah.
I speak nothing of God until after the conclusion.
Yeah. Well, and that was something that I found really interesting about when we started the first series is because you came on board and I was led to believe that this was going to be a Christian apologetics podcast.
Sure.
And then you started talking about this argument that had nothing to do with Big G God.
Big G, yeah.
You know, you had this argument that worked deductively from, hey, we can observe that the universe actually exists.
Sure.
And from there we get only that it had a cause for its existence.
Yeah.
No further.
Yeah.
And then from there, like you said, you can sort of infer the nature of a creator God based on the observable evidence from the cause of the universe's existence. But you never once started with this argument thinking to yourself, this is how I'm going to prove to the atheists that God exists. Because that doesn't make sense. You're not winning hearts that way.
And even like I still have, when people say, I'm going to prove to you God exists.
Good luck.
My first question is like, what do you mean by that?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know of anything I'm certain of, but the fact that something exists, right? Even if it's a brain in a vat exists, right?
Yeah.
I'm more certain that time exists than I'm certain of that I exist. Like there's just certain things that I'm more certain of, but I'm not certain, right? There's degrees, I think, of certainty when it comes to proving, right?
Yeah.
I'm not trying to go, let me prove to you beyond a shadow of the doubt that God exists. What I'm doing as an apologist, I'm going to go, one, I'm trying to take the stumbling blocks away, the roadblocks, I should say.
Yep.
A lot of people come in and be like, you're insane to think that an all-powerful being. I want to go, I don't think I'm insane. I think I am fully justified and reasonable to think that this is the.
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to do is go, the fact that you're looking at me like I'm an irrational person, I'm wiping that away.
Yeah.
And whether you believe that God exists, you can't walk away and go, Ryan is stupid and irrational.
Yeah.
That is what I'm trying to do here.
And I think that's good because there's a separation then between the work of an apologist and the work of an evangelist.
Absolutely.
You know, what you're trying to do right here is not evangelism.
No.
It's providing a logical framework for saying people of faith
Theism
can
be a theist.
Can be rational in their thought.
Absolutely. And I'm not going, hey, and we'll talk about this in another question. I'm not going like Christianity is true because of this. I'm just saying theism on general of this concept of a being that created everything. That's personal. That's all. That's really like something is out there. And when I look at people who think God exists, it matches up with these characteristics. And so why is this irrational? I don't know why it's irrational if this is the case. Now, whether you want to call it God or whatever the case is, we can have that conversation.
Yeah.
But theism should not be excluded. It should at least be God who was Greg that words it this way. Apologist is trying to get theism just back on the table to have a conversation.
Yeah.
They're just trying. It's been knocked off the table. It's been like, oh, we're through this
We've done away with God.
We're done away with God. It's like this option, kick it off. Let's talk about the science and different. No, let's bring it back to the table and see if it can work. And I think there's no reason why it was ever kicked off the table in the first place.
Yeah.
And
I see you've got a note here that says like you've been obsessed with the idea of infinity.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that, because how does that work in why the Kalam is important?
Yes.
And how that relates to getting God back on the table.
Sure. Yeah. So if you go back and listen to the part on the arguments from infinity, I don't know why I've been obsessed with infinity. It's just, I always grew up liking math, never being the best at math, but liking math.
I can appreciate that.
Yeah. I have a degree in finance with I think it was a minor in accounting. I can't remember if they give me enough credits. That was so long ago. But degree in I actually started off to be an accountant.
Yeah.
And I think I do because I moved away from accounting after a year and had all that stuff. But a degree in finance, bachelor's in finance. And I grew up in my dad's company doing the numbers, property management, the accounting stuff. So I just love numbers, right?
Yeah.
Anyone have a conversation about economics? I love that conversation of like, what is gold and silver going to do? What is Bitcoin going to do? All that stuff. Like, let's look at the charts. Let's talk about these numbers. And
what are the shoes going to do?
Yeah, right. Exactly. What are the sneakers? How are they going to resell? Market's down, guys. Start investing in something else if you can. But I've always loved that. And the idea of infinity is so mind-boggling to me of the concept of it. And we'll touch more of it on, I think, question 5 or 6, that it is such an enigma. And someone who loves math, I like to concentrate on it and think of it. And especially loving philosophy, You can't talk about infinity as just a purely mathematical thing. If you don't look at it also with the philosophical realm, you're doing injustice to your mathematics.
Wow. What?
Yeah.
Okay, talk about that for a little bit.
So I think when you just keep it within a mathematical realm, such as like a set theory, I think you're going to miss the nature of what it is.
The nature of infinity.
Of infinity. You can talk about the quantity of infinity and what that means when it comes to like set theory, but sort of a metaphysics of mathematics, I think, has a lot to say about how we understand math in general.
Okay.
And I think infinity is so weird to the mathematical realm that philosophy and paradoxes and contradictions of what it would be if it actually took place in reality, in the hard mathematical realm, what it would do to our worldview on allowance of like metaphysical principles.
Yeah. And you talked a lot about that in the
Yes.
Kalam series. You talked about how if an actual infinity exists, there's no reason to believe that we wouldn't just spontaneously combust, or something that is not unique to our reality could just happen.
Sure. You would have to bring in, just allow for strange occurrences in reality that I think the everyday person will go, that's clearly can't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you might go, well, theoretically, it's not logically. I think there are logical arguments that I've talked about in the previous podcast, like Dr. Proust brings up with the Grim Reaper stuff. But I do think it's a very tough pill to swallow that you can have a Hilbert's Hotel.
Yep.
That you can have a hotel that is completely full, yet simultaneously can hold everyone again.
Yep.
Yeah, it's completely occupied.
Right.
Like or you can have a library that you take out the same number of books that are left on the shelf as before.
Right. It's a logical fallacy.
If you fill up the gaps of the books that you take out, you haven't made any room on the shelf, even though you just took out an infinite amount of matter and mass. You have to allow this into reality if this is the case. And I think to the everyday person, it just goes, this seems so counterintuitive that this clearly can't be right.
And then how that relates to the Kalam.
And so, sorry, keep going.
Yeah, how that relates to the Kalam is this idea that God in the universe, correct me if I'm wrong here, is not an actual infinity. It's something that he's created as a finite piece of matter, right?
Yeah.
Like as a finite experience, but he himself is outside of that.
Sure.
So like, maybe I'm a little confused. So how do those two things work together?
Yeah, so what that does is people bring up the idea, as we talked in the first episode of this, that the universe is just necessary, right? It has always existed from eternity past.
Yep.
But if that's the case, you have to at least posit that it existed for an infinite amount of moments or days. It has always existed. Some people might go, well, different time theories, I think those are wrong. That's another podcast. But
we got no time for that.
We have no time for that. But they would say that it existed for an infinite amount of days prior to the present moment. But that would mean an actual infinite exists. But if you go, wait a minute, like, I think we shouldn't believe that an infinity can exist in reality. We have to say then that the past can't eternally exist.
Yeah.
It has to have come into creation a finite amount of time ago. Point. And if that's the case, then it leads you right back to the Kalam of what in the world could create the entire universe a finite amount of time ago.
Okay.
And so that's why I'm obsessed with this infinity argument. And I think it has way more weight to it than the science, which I think points to the fact that the universe began to exist.
Yeah, and that goes back to what you said earlier about the Kalam being a philosophical and scientific argument.
Yes.
Because they both point back at each other.
Absolutely.
And that's incredible to me.
Yeah, they could go, does science point, the best sort of theories we have, does it point back to a beginning? Yes. Okay. Well, now let's examine philosophically. Well, philosophically, the best explanation is that somewhere in the past, everything began to exist. And then what then caused the universe? And then you look at the qualities of what it would take to cause the universe, and you go, wow, this kind of seems like theism's not that weird.
Yeah. Well, and then that actually leads that really well into the next question that we have, because it said you were talking about how we've kind of taken theism off the table.
Yeah.
And how the Kalam is meant to like, hey, maybe this isn't so insane anymore.
Right.
You know, maybe this is actually a logical thing that we can follow.
Mm-hmm.
Is there, at any point in history, has the Kalam been used to misrepresent theism? Or I guess a better way to put this is, like, has the Kalam ever been misrepresented in ways that turning into something it isn't supposed to be?
Yeah. So,
like, have you ever experienced somebody using the Kalam to argue something that it was never meant to put back on the table?
Yeah, so I think there has been a lot of misunderstandings of the Kalam, a lot of objections that don't work to the Kalam because of misunderstandings. But I think the best thing, or the most I have seen, we'll put it this way, is that it has been used to produce a conclusion that says Christianity is true.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I don't think at all, like to the slightest bit, that the Kalam produces that.
Yeah.
I think the Kalam can get you to the monotheistic religions are correct, but I don't think it can get you to Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
All it does is to produce a conclusion that leads you to what kind of attributes the first cause would need to have.
Yeah.
Which you can justify, well, this is what I mean by God. But a lot of other religions would go, this is what I mean by God.
Yeah.
And so the question is, what then gets you to Christianity? Well, you need to bring in a whole slew of arguments. And I think C.S. Lewis's way of taking it of mere Christianity is a great way of doing it. God exists, resurrection's true. Because if the resurrection is true, as Paul says, then what we have is Christianity. And because all the other religions say, well, that's not true, right? And so I think what they've done is like, see, God exists, and therefore you should be a Christian. How in the world did you make that leap?
Right.
Well, you need to bring something else to the table. I will give you the jump of, I think God exists because of it, but I won't give you Christianity. You need way other things. And I think Christians have used that. And then what has happened is people who aren't believers go look at the leap of logic.
Yeah,
they've done something wrong with the Kalam that they've missed because of how bad their leap of logic is to get to Christianity. So I think when we make that misunderstanding, it sort of puts a bad taste in the mouth for the people to think that the Kalam's even true in the first point, because they clearly must have missed something over here.
Yeah.
If they can't logically see how this doesn't lead you to this.
Right.
So I would say that's probably the best misrepresentation I've heard of the Kalam.
So then to build on that then, so if you assume that the Kalam is an effective argument for the existence of a God, little g, how then do you get to those characteristics that are consistent with the God of the Bible? Because like you said, if you go into it from, hey, the Kalam is a logical and sound argument that you can prove the existence of a deity, and then use that as justification to say, hey, see, this is why Jesus is the best one.
Right.
Like, that doesn't make sense. You have to, like you said, you have to bring things in.
Sure.
So what does that look like?
Sure. What I would do is, and we talked about this in the first episode, like, hey, when you looked at the other arguments for God, Christianity is not just here's one argument Christianity is true. Christianity is a worldview. And that means that aspects of all of reality should match up with this world. And so that also then follows that you can bring in other aspects of reality to help prove and show that Christianity is the one you should believe in.
Yeah.
And for the arguments for God's existence, it's not Kalam, we've done it. It's Kalam with Leibniz, with moral, with NDEs, with resurrection, with this. Like I said, with the ontological argument, I think it's sound. But I don't think it's a good argument to present first and foremost. But if you bring in the Leibniz, the Kalam, and then you throw the ontological argument, where you go, oh my gosh, the probability of God existing is really high.
What is he like?
Yeah. What do you do with this? Like should I give more weight to the fact that he should exist if is the ontological argument true? Therefore, God does exist, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's the best way to go about it when we look at these code of arguments. We take all of them. It's
it's a
take
just all
and
thing.
Compile it together. And because the more sort of weight you can add to theism and Christianity being true, why wouldn't you take that? But I do think the Kalam gets you to, and let me give you some of these attributes I've had if you want to go back and listen to more of it.
Yeah, and I think I'm recognizing a lot of these verses too from our earlier series,
Yes.
talking about why God is a good answer to the Kalam's question,
yes.
So, yeah, well, let's walk through some of these
Yeah.
again.
So what we have is timeless and eternal.
Yep.
We have extremely powerful, right? Because the being who created, or the thing, I should say, that created the universe, so we'll make it more generic, is extremely powerful if you created the universe.
Yep.
Right? You want to go, that guy's weak.
Yeah,
That thing's
exactly.
weak, whatever that is. Spaceless and immaterial, because if all space came into existence, then the thing would have to be spaceless, right?
Yep. Outside
Because
of space.
how do you exist in a space prior to its existence?
Right.
It'd be very weird. I don't even know what that means. It would be a necessary being,
Mhm.
right? Because if it wasn't necessary and contingent, the Kalam would just work on that thing again. And then you ask what created that thing, and then what created that thing, and what created.
And that doesn't get you anywhere.
Yeah, at some point you get back to like a metaphysically necessary thing.
Yep.
That is like the firm root and ground foundation of everything. And then personal. And I went to the two arguments of why. I think the idea was asking why wasn't then, if all the proper and necessarily insufficient things were in the cause, the effect should happen.
Mm-hmm.
And why wasn't the universe then eternal with the first cause? And there's options, right?
Yeah.
And the big option was because the thing made a choice, and choices are made by personal.
Okay. Yeah.
And then I used another example of wife making tea.
Right.
You can ask why, like, what's happening here, right? And she can go through all the math of, the
water
friction
boils at
is water-
212.
Yeah, or she can say, I wanted it.
I wanted tea.
But the problem is the laws of nature talk about the tea kettle and the friction and the steam. But prior to the laws of nature, we don't have that kind of description on why this thing happened. So the only other explanation is that a choice. So you have the laws or a personal explanation, right? If the laws don't exist to explain things, what do you have left? You have the personal explanation. And once again, choices are made by personal things.
Yeah.
And so you have timeless, eternal, extremely powerful, spaceless, immaterial, necessary, and personal. And why I think we can go, well, Christianity is not nuts in thinking that a being like God exists, is because all throughout Scripture, we have testimony to God filling out or having these attributes.
Yeah.
For instance, Isaiah 48:28, when it comes to timeless and eternal, have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not grow faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He is everlasting. He is from the beginning to the end. He's always existed, right? Psalm 92, before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you have formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, which is just like Hebrew idiom, meaning you will be here, you've always been here, and you will continue to always be here.
Right.
Extremely powerful, right? I don't think we need a verse from the Bible to understand that.
Right.
But Job 26:14, behold, these are the outskirts of his ways, and how small a whisper do we hear of him? But the thunder of his power, who can understand?
Yeah.
He's looking at creation and Job goes, look at everything you've done.
Yeah. And this is a fraction of it.
Yeah, a fraction of it. Spaceless and material, John 4:24, God is spirit.
Yep. Pretty sound.
Now,
I am really interested in your answer for this next one here, because
Sure.
I'm looking at your notes here and there's no Bible verse. So
Yes.
give me how you can justify the necessity of God.
Sure. So what I think philosophy points to it. I
Yep.
think science and the Kalam points to it. And so what we have is the Bible doesn't lay out terms like necessity. I think necessity was a term they understood, given Plato and all these other giant thinkers prior to scriptures were being written, right? Especially in the New Testament. But I think Genesis 1 points to the fact that in the beginning, God literally created everything. And John 1 points to, through Christ, everything that was created
Mm-hmm.
through him and for him. So that would show me that the Word was not a contingent being.
Yep.
And that God was not a contingent being. And that everything that was created for him, meaning anything that existed, therefore, is a necessary thing and not a contingent thing.
Right.
And so if the Word, meaning Christ, that John is referring to, was the creator of everything that was ever created and ever exists beyond himself, that would at least point to the fact that the word is not a contingent thing.
It's self-evident.
It is self-evident, meaning that it has to fall into the other category of necessary.
Right.
And so though it doesn't explicitly say necessary, I think you can implicitly get that God and Jesus are necessary beings according to what we see in Genesis and John. Is that helpful?
That's extremely helpful. I thought it was curious that there wasn't a Bible verse here listed that you could point to, like you said earlier with that passage in Job. Like, yeah, you can prove that God is extremely powerful based on his nature.
Sure.
The necessity part, that's tricky because I don't even think as humans we're meant to understand the necessity of God. Like,
yeah, I think he is at least lightly transcendent, which means there are some things that's impossible without him revealing to himself that we can't know.
Yeah.
And I think the necessity of his nature and how that works is something that we can at least look and go, well, he has to be necessary. And a lot of these attributes, therefore, are necessary because they're a part of his nature. But he hasn't revealed everything about himself.
Yeah.
And so we can only go so far on specific things. But I do think he at least gives us the fact through reasoning that we can at least conclude that he's necessary from Scripture, even though it's not a verse like Job or John. God's spirit.
God is spirit. Yeah.
God is spirit. Here's three
Nobody
words.
ever said God is necessary.
Yeah, exactly.
And then this last one here, you've got personal.
Sure. And I don't think you can read through Scripture, Old Testament and New Testament, with the belief that God is not personal.
Sure.
I don't know how that's possible. We have our Heavenly Father, right? We have him answering prayers. We have him showing himself to people. We have general and special revelation. I mean, God to Moses, like, I will show myself to you, all of my glory, but I'm going to shield you.
Mm-hmm.
If this isn't a personal being that interacts with creation, I don't know what personal means anymore.
Yeah. And he formed, if the Genesis account is to be believed, he formed Adam out of the dust of the earth.
Yes. Everything in Scripture points to the fact that God is a personal being.
Yeah.
And if you say it's not possible, I don't know what
you have to rethink what personal
I don't
means.
know what it means.
Yeah.
I don't think philosophers will know what it means. They have to create some definition that you would go, that's the most bizarre definition.
Yeah.
And so personal, it just seems clear to me that God is a being that can make choices, that has a will. I mean, that's explicit, God's will, right?
Mm-hmm.
All throughout Scripture, that has a plan for us, that is intervening, that is upholding, that is talking, that is doing miracles, that is sending his son himself in order to redeem creation because he loves us. If that's not a personal being, then I don't know what is.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
That's so good.
He is more personal than we are.
Yeah.
And if we can go, well, God's not personal, there's no way we can conclude we are.
Yeah.
I don't know how you get around that.
Right.
And so, yeah, we have timeless, eternal, extremely powerful, spaceless and material, necessary and personal. Now, that's what the Kalam gets you out of attributes of the first cause. It doesn't say this is God. It just says this is what we get to.
This is what it could be.
This is what it could be.
Yeah.
This is what it seems that it is. And then you go, okay, this is going to lead me to theological conclusions.
Right.
If I want it to lead me to theological conclusions, which I think you can.
Yeah. And you can let it do that.
Exactly.
So, and I've got another couple of questions here for you. This one's actually from a listener, I believe.
Yep.
And we touched about this a little bit. We talked about the library. We talked about your other example of the hotel rooms.
Absolutely.
Why can't God create an actual infinity? Because this was one of the big, like, scary things that you said in an earlier episode where you talked about things that God can't do. That, as Christians, that's not something that we love to admit.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
I think people get really antsy. I know I did. When you started talking about, like, I'm going to list some things that God can't do. I'm like, oh boy, I might need to look for another job.
That. I'm like, don't run away. I'm not a heretic. I think there are things God can't do because they're just non-things.
Yeah.
It's not that there's any limit to his power. And I'm going to read a C.S. Lewis quote at the end here. I just don't think there are logically possible things. And so it's just not a thing for God to do. And that has nothing to do with who he is. It's just not a thing.
Yeah. So with regard to the infinity question, how does that work?
Yeah. So the argument, one of the arguments I laid out in the portion where I said the argument against infinity, here's one of them. Like, an actual infinite cannot exist. An infinite temple of regress of events is an actual infinite, meaning going backwards in time Therefore, temporal infinite regress of events cannot exist. And we argued absurd things would happen in reality.
Yep.
And I gave some examples of what contradictions that could happen, or I think are contradictions, where, for instance, this will happen yet can't happen at the same time, right? And I don't know about you, that seems like it must happen and can't happen. Seems to be
highly
logical contradictory to me. And so a lot of people have asked, why can't God just go, boom, here's your infinity? Why can't he do that, right? The concept is logical to him, but an infinity is. Why can't he just go, boom? Now, I have a lot to say, which we don't have time for, on the idea of the concept versus what we can actually know of it. I think people just assume the concept of infinity and just say, therefore, it is in reality, versus no, like a concept doesn't guarantee its ontology. A concept just says, this is the definition I'm giving it. Whether we can fully, truly, logically do it.
There's a difference between understanding something and then conceptualizing it.
Sure, yeah. There's a difference between going like, this is what I mean by this, versus I can clearly understand every aspect of it, but this is just what I mean by it.
Yeah.
And so I think it is helpful, and I could be wrong in this, but I don't think I'm wrong, to see what infinity actually is. And I did a lot of philosophical terms, a lot of weird things that people might go, let's just fast forward through this. But I think to just look at it real simply, to help us understand it, will help us see why I don't think God can just simultaneously create an infinity. And I'm going to ask you this, Eric.
Yeah.
And in a very primitive, simple way of thinking about it.
Sure.
When I say something is infinite, what do you think I mean by that? What do you think the listeners and watchers understand infinity to be? Because there are a lot of like
really tough
mathematical
question.
definitions, or part is equal to the whole. Yeah, I get that, right? That's in concept, right?
Yeah.
But when someone's thinking of infinity, like I have an infinite amount of coins, or this natural numbers are infinite. What do you have in your head? It'd be interesting to know what you have in your head.
I think numbers is it's an easier concept to wrap your head around, because if you said I had an infinite number of apples, that's absurd. That it, like, to me, like, even just the thought
why
of
is
that,
it absurd?
You can't because here's why.
Okay.
Because the moment you start counting the apples, they cease to be infinite.
Sure.
To me, at least, you start counting the apples, you have one apple.
Sure.
That's a beginning. An infinite can't have a beginning. So that is illogical then. If you had a bushel of infinite apples, you don't. And that's that is in my, maybe this is a bad argument, but I'm not a mathematician.
Okay.
But like in my mind, that's a contradiction. So if you start with counting the first of your infinite apples, you have then created a beginning.
Okay.
And so because a beginning has or because the infinity has no beginning, I think you've just logically proven you don't have infinite apples.
Okay. So I think an infinity can have a beginning.
Okay.
So let me take your logic and sort of throw it to the back end if we can.
Yeah.
So I asked my wife this question, and this is basically what she said. When someone says I have an infinite amount of things, I have a set. I'm just I have a grouping. I have a pile of things.
Yep.
That there is literally no end to the number of objects. There is no end to it. If you say I have an infinite amount of coins stacked up, she goes, well, yeah. Well, how many coins do you have? She goes, I don't know. The number just keeps going.
Mm-hmm.
We have literally conceptually never thought of numbers in that number line. We just say infinite is this, like the term we put to the set in limit. How many are in there? You just say it's infinite, but we never have gone, this is 18 gazillion dodillion. Like, we just never have done that. We just assumed like this is infinite.
But that number has to exist.
Sure. Yeah. We just assumed it. But she's like, no, I think of a pile of shoes that I could never count through, and there's no end. It just keeps going. There's just literally no end to it. And I go, yeah, you can say it's a limit at the end, but I don't know that in me, that's just a concept, right?
Yep.
But to say there is an end doesn't make sense, because it just keeps going. You can attach a term limit to it, that's fine, and call it infinite. But what we have is a thing that has no end to how many things are in it.
Yeah. And I think that's why numbers for me are easy to conceptualize as infinity.
Like if I go 0, 1, 2, 3, that set of natural numbers.
Yep.
Or just all the set of positive, starting from 0, odd numbers or even numbers. And I'm going to go keep going. You're going to think of, okay, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and you're just going to keep going. There is no end to this line.
Yeah.
That's what you're going to think, right?
Yeah. And same in reverse. If you go with negative numbers, you're going to have
-1, -2, -3, all the way. And you're going to go, well, how many are in there? You go, I don't know. It's infinite. It will just keep going. There is no end. Whether you say it's a limit, fine. It just says that this is the concept of limit I'm talking about. That's sort of how I understand it.
And that's why
I think a lot of people understand it like that. But
that's why numbers, I think, are easier. Because if you have numbers inherently are made up, they're conceptual.
Yeah.
One doesn't exist. It only exists as a concept in our mind. Apples, you can prove it. Apples, you can pick up an apple. You have an apple, you know.
But if how you understand how my wife understands it goes, there's just
can't do it.
There's just I don't know a number to the pile of shoes. It just keeps going. There is no end to it. It just keeps going.
Right.
And to say, hey, I've stopped it here is to say, like, why can't I add one more? Well, why did you stop the amount of shoes I can put on the pile right here?
Right.
Can't I just add another shoe? It's the same thing with the library.
Yep.
Like, I have an infinite limit. Well, I can still put a book into it. And you have the same number there.
Yeah.
But I can add to it. I can add an infinite amount of infinites to the library. Though it's still the same number, which is absolutely bizarre. But she's like, no, it just keeps going. But here's the problem. If you want to say God can simultaneously go, boom, what you have done is you've put a marker of where the beginning, where the end is. For him to go, I'm creating everything. Does that make sense?
Maybe.
So if you go, okay, God's going to create an actual infinity, meaning he has created an endpoint where there is no limit where you can put one more into it. But the problem with infinity is, why can't I just add one more?
Okay. Yeah.
So God created an infinite pile of shoes. Why can't he just add one more? I can just add one more to it. I just go one more on the number line. What is in English that last term to that? It's gobillion.
Yeah.
Well, gobillion plus 1.
Right. Do that. Yeah.
Just keep going. Just keep going. But to say he created an infinite is to say that you have put boundary markers.
Oh, okay.
From the beginning to the end, but I'm going to say keep going. Just keep going. He's never going to, in my mind, ever stop creating to even be able to create.
Continue.
He'd just continue.
Yeah.
And you say, well, simultaneously does it. It is telling me that in our common sense of we just add another number, add another shoe, add this. There is no end to this. But you just said God has marked the boundaries of an end to something that everyone's mind is endless.
Yeah.
But I don't know if something's endless, how you can give me an end boundary.
Right.
For God to say, I've finished completing my creation.
Yeah.
It makes, why create another day? Create one more thing on the end.
Yeah.
Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. And I know, like, in the set theory, they just sort of assume it as one of their axioms, like an actual infinite is possible and can exist, right?
Yep.
I think set theory has to assume a lot of axioms to avoid terrible
logical
paradoxes.
fallacies. Yeah.
But just simply put, if you ask someone, what does it mean? Well, there's no end to it. But if God created an actual infinite, he created an end. He created literally a limit that you can't go past. And you just say, well, the limit's endless, doesn't do anything to help me with explaining how God can create an infinity. Yeah. You're just assuming he can.
Right. And this isn't to put a limit on what God can do.
No.
It's saying that he wouldn't.
Yeah. It's just to say that God created a limit to something is by definition limitless. Or he created an end to something by definition has no end. It's
like the burrito question, It's like the Jesus burrito question. You know what I'm talking about?
I've never heard of that.
Oh my gosh. You're one of today's lucky 10,000.
Okay, perfect.
So the Jesus burrito thing is like, if Jesus is omnipotent, can he microwave a burrito so hot that he himself can't eat it?
Oh, so it's like the rock. Can God
it's the
create
rock
a boulder that it's too heavy for him to lift?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
It's just
we really modernized that one. Taco and burrito here.
I can't believe this.
That's funny. So here's how I would answer.
Yep.
And I think just understanding that, and I know a lot of people are like, well, this is wrong, but just we can talk about where you think that's wrong, but just think of the concept of what the everyday person understands infinity. You just can't assume an infinite limit. What is infinity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here's how I'd answer. If an actual infinity cannot exist, then God cannot create one's existence.
Okay.
You just can't. If it cannot exist, then it doesn't matter. He just can't create his existence because it's impossible.
Logically, yeah.
It's not that he lacks power. It's not a thing that is possible for God to create. So here's C.S. Lewis. I love what he writes about this when he comes to talk about God's omnipotence, because this is sort of what it crosses the line on omnipotence. He says this, his omnipotence means the power to do all that is intrinsically possible, not to do the intrinsically impossible. You may attribute miracles to him, but not nonsense. This is no limit to his power. If you choose to say God can give a creature free will and at the same time withhold free will from him, you have not succeeded in saying anything about God. Meaningless combinations of words do not suddenly acquire meaning simply because we prefix them to the two words God can. It remains true that all things are possible with God. The intrinsic impossibilities are not things, but non-entities. Mm-hmm. It is no more possible for God than for the weakest of his creature to carry out both of two mutually exclusive alternatives, not because his power meets an obstacle, because nonsense remains nonsense even when we talk about it about God.
Right.
I say it this way, God can do anything that is logically possible.
Yeah.
He can't do what is not logically possible because it's a no thing.
It's he
can do all things that are possible to do.
Yeah.
And I just think creating simultaneously an actual infinite, when we truly go, what is it? It's just not a possibility.
Yeah. It's not that it isn't. It's not that God lacks the power to.
Whether
you're asking a question that doesn't exist.
The concept,
Yeah.
It doesn't matter to me. That's perfectly fine. If it is literally no end to something, how can you say he created the end point?
Right.
To something that is endless. I can't wrap my mind around it.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say when it comes to that question.
Yeah. And we've got one last one here. This is another one from a listener. So we'll give a call out to how you can ask more questions. If we've raised more questions than we've answered in this episode, we can.
Or you have objections to what we said, I'll be fine.
We'll be happy to answer those. But we got one more, and it's just kind of what we talked about earlier when we were talking about why the Kalam gives us the nature of God.
Sure.
And I asked the same question. Other religions believe in a God, little g.
Right.
Why not their religions? Why Christianity's God, big G God?
Yeah.
Then, like we talked about earlier, why not the Buddha, or why not Vishnu, or any one of the gods of any other religion? Why does Yahweh fit the description of the Kalam better than the others?
Sure. So I have a few points to this. I think the Kalam, and I'll give you sort of my answer. I think the Kalam gets you to the monotheistic religions of this world.
Okay.
Judaism.
Yep.
Islam. Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And here's a few points I want to bring up. One, many other religions' gods don't meet the required attributes that the Kalam lays out.
Okay.
It just doesn't. For instance, you have a lot of people who believe in gods per se that like Buddha, right? Or Buddhism, where there's a lot of many gods that had a part of creation, right? But the problem is those gods were created from the natural order.
Okay.
So you have a kind of God that doesn't fit the description of the God required to create everything.
One that's outside of the natural order.
You need to properly give me that entity that fits these attributes that would then create the religion to create these other gods, right? So I don't think all these other gods meet the required attributes of the Kalam. Second, if the infinity argument is true, I think it wipes away all the other ones but the monotheistic religions. If you have an infinite amount of gods, what happens then is you have an infinite amount of gods who are distinct from each other, or have different minds from each other, who have maybe different actions from each other. What happens then is and they always existed, you have an infinite regress problem. Because now you have gods, you have these infinities within moments, within different distinct mental moments that other gods are having. or say this one God did something different than this God in this heavenly realm that always existed. Well, the problem is then you have an infinite regress of when those actions happened. So if infinity cannot happen, you can't have these infinite regresses, which would be required of these other religions.
Right.
And so if the infinity argument is true, it has to wipe away all these religions that propose infinite regresses of gods always existed or coming to exist with each other. Also, most of the religions out there have gods that are physical, but if no physical nature existed or no realm, they need to be spaceless and immaterial. Then the Kalam wipes away all those gods who are of material.
Right.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so what you get when you look at all these attributes and infinity arguments and what science points to is the top 3 monotheistic religions of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Islam, Christianity, Judaism.
Because those gods assume the characteristics inherent
these
to
attributes
creating.
Don't fall into these paradoxes, don't have all of these infinite regress problems. So
Right.
you get those 3. So I think the Kalam can literally go, I'm going to leave these 3, take all the other ones and wipe them away. And so that's why I don't believe, I don't have to go through a million other religions.
Yeah.
Because people go like, why don't you have 10,000 other religions? Why don't you test those out first? I go, I don't think I need to.
Right.
If the Kalam is true, it gets me to 3.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, if it's right, which I think it is, then I don't have to worry about the other ones because they just don't match.
Because they don't fit the
They
set.
don't fit. They don't fit what is required if this logically follows. And then you go into resurrection arguments. Boom, then you have your Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
So I have this note here that I wanna read for you guys before we log off for this episode.
Right.
I go, we cannot forget that Christianity doesn't solely rely on arguments for God's existence. It just doesn't. As I stated before, I do not think it is reasonable. Sorry, I do not think it is an argument for the Christian faith. It is an argument that allows me to think that it is reasonable to think that a being like that of God of the Christian faith actually exists. And I think we need to bring in other things to prove this. For example, I'm not a Muslim or I'm not Jewish because I think Jesus' resurrection arguments are so strong.
Mm-hmm.
Just the case. I think the arguments for the beauty of the Quran fail miserably. Therefore, the reason why it's God's word or what they actually state as an argument does not work for me. I also think the evidence for the apostles' firsthand testimony is extremely strong. That what we have is actual historical proof of this is the eyewitness. And I think God as the greatest being logically possible is far more possible on the Christian faith than on the other religions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I bring in all these other things as a subset with the Kalam in my apologetics.
Yeah. To supplement
each other.
Yeah.
And I think that's how it needs to work because worldviews are very vast and very deep. And if Christianity is true, it's true of all of reality.
Yeah. And
you just can't put Christianity into one compartment over here and one compartment over here. That's why when I talk to people about like human sexuality, right? It's not, I don't like this, therefore your religion's false. You're talking about a moral thing, which is a metaphysical principle, right? And then you have to go, okay, which worldview metaphysically is true first? Because that will dictate then what you don't like or do like when it comes to reality. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
And so I think it is a worldview sum total that it speaks to. And if that's true, then I should be able to see compartments of reality and go, well, that points to this. That points to this truth. That points to this truth. And if all of a sudden you have a worldview that's not coherent with each other, we got to re-examine this.
Yeah.
And I think the Kalam is just one component of a reality that points to the fact that I'm a rational person to think that a being like God exists.
Yeah. And I think that's great. Like you said, this isn't something that you can use as an evangelistic tool to then determine like, hey, because the Kalam is logical and exists, that means that Christianity got it right.
Sure.
You need to bring in those other things.
Absolutely.
And you need to work through why moral code exists,
Sure.
why you observe and experience certain things the way that you do and how that fits with the rest of these arguments.
Absolutely.
Like that to me is a much more attractive way to work through these arguments of like, why might there be a God rather than why is this God the best one?
Correct. Right.
Because you're not going to win hearts that way.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
thank you for doing all of this.
Yeah,
This has
absolutely.
been really cool for me just to go through some of these questions. Because like I said, some of these were mine. A lot of these were from listeners' questions.
Yeah.
And I think it's been very helpful for all of us listening to go through and say, let's narrow down on a few of these.
Yeah, absolutely. We have one, maybe two more episodes in this series of the Checking In series. So if you have any questions or want to drop us a comment on new topics, please do so. We like listening to them. We are responding to them. Or even if you want to come along as a prayer partner or even financially help support this podcast, please email me at ryan@ryanwillert.org. That's WILLERT, not ARD, the rat guy of the crowd story. ERT, ryan@ryanwillert.org, or visit the podcast page at riverradio.com. We'll see you next time on In Defense.
This podcast is a production of River Radio Ministries. You can find more podcasts like this one at riverradio.com. And if you like what you're hearing, make sure to subscribe wherever you're listening now, and be sure to tell a friend so they can listen too.